Our story begins not with the sea, but with the suffocating smog of Manchester in 1891. Thomas Abernathy was a man hollowed out by grief, a former clerk in a cotton mill. His world had been vibrant and full until a cholera outbreak. A swift and merciless thief had stolen his wife and young daughter in the space of a single week. The city, once his home, became a monument to his loss. Every street corner held a memory. Every factory whistle sounded like a funeral dirge. He needed to escape, not just the city, but the noise of his own mind. In a newspaper, tucked between shipping news and advertisements for patent medicines, he saw it, an advertisement from Trinity House, seeking able-bodied men of sober habits and good character to serve as assistant lighthouse keepers. The words seemed to promise everything he craved: solitude, purpose, a world scrubbed clean of memory by salt and wind. He imagined a life of stark simplicity, a penance that might, in time, wash him clean. He applied. After a brief, austere interview in a London office where his quiet grief was likely mistaken for a steady temperament, he was accepted. His posting was to a place that existed only as a name on a nautical chart, the Dragon's Tooth Lighthouse, a notorious rock station thrusting from the sea some 15 miles off the Cornish coast. The name itself should have been a warning. The journey to the Tooth was a descent into a new kind of reality. The train from London to Penzance was the last vestige of his old world. The final leg was on the relief boat, a sturdy vessel named the Petrel, which bobbed and crashed through the waves with an alarming violence. The mainland grew smaller, then became a hazy smudge, and then vanished entirely. For 2 hours there was nothing but a churning, gray-green expanse of water under a sky the color of slate. Thomas, pale and seasick, huddled on the deck, the cold spray stinging his face. And then he saw it. At first it was just a needle on the horizon. As they drew closer, it resolved into a perfect, impossible cylinder of granite, rising sheer from a jagged black rock that was perpetually slick with foam. The Dragon's Tooth. It wasn't a building on an island. It was the island itself. It looked less like a human habitation and more like a geological feature, a stone finger pointing a warning at God. There was no harbor, no beach, not even a patch of green. Waves crashed against its base with a relentless, percussive force. As the Petrel drew alongside, timing the swell of the waves, a winch was lowered from a door high up the tower. Thomas's meager trunk was hooked on and hoisted up, disappearing into the stone. Then it was his turn. He was strapped into a harness, hooked to the rope, and in a moment of terrifying dislocation, he was swung out over the churning sea and winched up the side of the cold, weeping granite. His feet touched a narrow stone landing, and he was quickly unstrapped and hustled inside by a man whose face seemed to be carved from the same granite as the tower. The iron door clanged shut behind him, and the sound was one of absolute finality. The roar of the sea was instantly muffled, replaced by a strange, resonant silence. He had arrived. He was home. He was in a circular room at the base of the tower, its walls thick and bare, smelling of damp stone, paraffin, and salt. The man who had unhooked him was the principal keeper, Ewan MacLeod. He was a Scot, a man of perhaps 50 years, with a thick grey beard and eyes so pale they seemed to have been bleached by the sea. He spoke little, his words clipped and functional. "Abernathy," he said, not as a question but a statement of fact. "You'll be on the middle watch. Ross will show you the ropes. Your bunk is on the 3rd level." Mr. Ross was Finn Ross, the other assistant keeper. He was a younger man, perhaps not yet 30, with restless energy and a spark of anger in his eyes that hadn't yet been extinguished by the routine. He greeted Thomas with a curt nod and a look that sized him up and found him wanting. The tour was brief. The lighthouse was a vertical world, a winding stone staircase, its steps worn into shallow bowls by decades of footfalls, corkscrewed up through the tower's core. Each level was a single circular room. The base was for storage, barrels of oil, sacks of flour, coils of rope. The next level was the kitchen and mess, dominated by a small cast-iron stove. Above that, the sleeping quarters, with 3 narrow bunks built into the curve of the wall. Above that, the watchroom, a small chamber with thick glass windows and a desk where the logbook was kept. And finally, at the very top, reached by a steep iron ladder, was the Holy of Holies, the lantern room. It was here that the rules were laid out, not in a friendly chat, but in a series of clipped commands from MacLeod. The rules were the true master of the lighthouse. They were the gospel according to Trinity House, a rigid liturgy designed to keep the men sane and the light burning. "You will refer to me as Mr. MacLeod, and to him as Mr. Ross," Ewan stated, his voice echoing slightly in the glass chamber. "You are Mr. Abernathy. There are no first names on the Tooth. Familiarity breeds contempt.
Contempt breeds negligence. He explained the watch system. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock, without fail, forever. During the watch, the keeper's sole duty was to the light. No reading, no sleeping, no distractions. He showed Thomas the logbook, a massive, leather-bound volume. Every single event had to be recorded in it. The weather conditions at the start of each watch, the amount of oil consumed, the number of birds that struck the glass, any passing ships. The entries were to be neat, precise, and devoid of personal comment. The logbook was the tower's memory, its official emotionless history. The work is divided, MacLeod continued. Ross is responsible for the engine and the foghorn. You, Abernathy, will be responsible for the domestic duties and assisting me with the lamp and the lens. There is no your work or my work. There is only the work, and the work must always be done. The final, unspoken rule hung in the air. You do not speak of the shore. You do not speak of wives or children or the lives you left behind. The tower was its own world, a separate reality. To speak of the other place was to invite a sickness, the particular madness of the rock known as the Shemitah. That first night, Thomas lay in his bunk, the stone cold against his back. The tower was not silent. It hummed, it groaned, it seemed to breathe around him. Through the thick walls, he could feel the deep resonant thud of the waves against the rock, a constant rhythmic pummeling that vibrated through his very bones. It was the sound of a giant sleeping heart. He had sought solitude, and he had found it, but it was not the peaceful, healing silence he had imagined. It was the silence of a tomb, the crushing, absolute silence of a stone prison in the middle of the sea.
The romantic notion of a lighthouse keeper's life dissolves completely when confronted with the reality of the routine. The routine was everything. It was a relentless, unchangeable cycle of tasks designed to fill every waking moment, to leave no space for idle thought, because idle thought was the pathway to madness. For Thomas Abernathy, the days and weeks on the Dragon's Tooth bled into one another, distinguished only by the endless grinding repetition of the work. It was a life governed not by the sun or the moon, but by the tyranny of the clockwork cog. His day began with his watch. He would be woken by a sharp rap on the door from Finn Ross, his face a pale mask in the lantern light. Middle watch, Mr. Abernathy. Thomas would dress quickly in the chill air and ascend the winding stairs to the watchroom. MacLeod would be there, a silent sentinel. They would exchange no words, only a nod. MacLeod would make his final entry in the logbook and then descend, leaving Thomas alone with the light. The lantern room was a cage of glass and iron, suspended between the sea and the sky. In its center was the source of all their labor, the great Fresnel lens. It was a breathtaking object, a beehive of crystal prisms and bullseyes, 8 feet tall, meticulously crafted to gather the light from a single flame and project it into a piercing beam that could be seen for 20 miles. It rotated silently on a bath of mercury, driven by a clockwork mechanism. This mechanism was the heart of the tower. It was powered by a heavy weight that hung in a shaft running down the center of the lighthouse. Every few hours, the on-duty keeper had to winch the weight back to the top. The task was accompanied by the slow, loud, metronomic clack-clack-clack of the pawl on the ratchet, a sound that became the inescapable soundtrack to their lives. For 4 hours, Thomas would sit on a small stool, his world reduced to this glass room. His tasks were simple, but required absolute focus. He had to monitor the argan lamp, ensuring the wick was trimmed perfectly to produce a bright, clean, smokeless flame. He had to keep the clockwork mechanism wound, and he had to watch the flame, watch the sea, watch the sky. 4 hours of profound, unblinking boredom. When his watch was over, the work did not stop. His primary responsibility was the brasswork. The sea air was a relentless, corrosive enemy. Every single piece of metal in the lighthouse, door handles, railings, lamp fittings, ventilation cowls, was made of brass, and every single piece had to be polished. Every single day, Thomas would spend hours with a tin of brasso and a stack of soft rags, working his way through the tower. He would start in the lantern room, polishing the intricate frame of the lens until it shone with a dull golden luster. The smell of the polish, a sharp chemical tang, was omnipresent. He would work his way down the spiral staircase, polishing the handrail until it was slick and warm to the touch. It was a Sisyphean task. The moment he finished, the salt in the air would already be starting its work again, laying a new faint film of tarnish. The polishing was not about achieving a permanent state of cleanness. It was a daily act of defiance, a way to impose a small temporary human order on the overwhelming chaos of the sea. It was a way to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering into the dark places it so desperately wanted to go. The most sacred task was cleaning the lens itself.
This was performed under the hawk-eyed supervision of Mr. McLeod. It was a delicate, ritualized process. First, the entire lens array was draped in protective linen covers, then one section at a time was uncovered. Each individual prism was dusted with a fine feather brush to remove any particles, then gently polished with a soft chamois cloth, and finally given a finishing wipe with a piece of pure silk. No water, no cleaning agents, only the gentle friction of the cloth. It was meticulous, painstaking work. To scratch or chip a prism was the ultimate sin, a desecration. McLeod treated the lens not as a piece of equipment, but as a sacred jewel, and Thomas, despite himself, began to feel the same. This giant, intricate piece of glass was their god, and they were its priests, performing their daily ablutions. The domestic chores fell to him as well. He would bake their bread, a dense, heavy soda bread that was always slightly damp from the humid air. He would cook their meals, monotonous affairs of salted beef, tinned vegetables, and potatoes. Mealtimes were silent, functional events. The three men would eat quickly, their eyes fixed on their plates, the only sounds the scrape of cutlery and the distant moan of the wind. Finn would often push his food around his plate, his jaw tight with a permanent simmering frustration. McLeod ate with a slow, methodical rhythm, as if he were consuming fuel rather than food. The social dynamic in this tiny vertical world was a constant low-level strain. The Trinity House rules were designed to prevent conflict, but they also created a sterile, inhuman environment. Thomas tried to make conversation once, mentioning something he'd read in a month-old newspaper that had come with the last delivery. McLeod had simply stared at him with those pale eyes until he trailed off into an embarrassed silence. "The work, Mr. Abernathy," was all he said. Finn was the opposite. He seemed desperate for conflict, for any spark to break the monotony. He would complain under his breath about the food, or bang his tools with unnecessary force while working on the foghorn engine. He and McLeod orbited each other in a state of perpetual silent antagonism. Thomas learned to make himself as small and unobtrusive as possible, a ghost in the machine. He did his work, he kept his silence, and he polished the brass. Days turned into weeks. Thomas lost track of time. His world shrank to the dimensions of the tower, 70 feet of granite, 3 men, 1 light. He learned the tower's language, the groan of the iron door in the wind, the particular hum the lens made as it turned, the weary sigh of the waves after a gale. He was no longer a clerk from Manchester. He was an assistant keeper. He was a cog in the machine, a servant to the light. He had sought a life of simplicity, and he had found it. But it was the simplicity of a prison cell, a routine so absolute and unchanging that it began to grind away at the very edges of his soul.
For a keeper on a rock station, boredom was the chronic illness, the slow decay that ate away at the spirit day by day. But there were moments when this crushing monotony was shattered by its polar opposite, sheer primal terror. A great storm was not just bad weather, it was a siege. It was a time when the sea, their constant, murmuring companion, rose up like a wrathful god to try and reclaim the impudent stone finger that dared to defy it. For Thomas, who had become accustomed to the tower's rhythmic groans, his first great storm was an education in the true, terrifying power of the ocean. It began subtly. For 2 days, the sea had been unnaturally calm, a sheet of leaden glass under a sky thick with a yellowish haze. The air grew heavy, humid, and still. Mr. McLeod became even more withdrawn than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand tapping the barometer in the watchroom with a nervous frequency. "The glass is falling," he announced one evening, his voice flat, falling like a stone. Finn grew more agitated, his restless energy turning into a palpable tension. He double-checked the storm shutters on the lower windows, his movements jerky and aggressive. He tested the foghorn, and its deep, mournful bellow echoed across the still water, a lonely cry into the coming void. The storm arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. A low, deep moan of wind began to build from the southwest. The sea, which had been so flat, began to heave in long, oily swells. Within hours, the moan had become a shriek, a physical force that hammered against the lantern room glass. The sky turned a bruised purple black, and the day became a perpetual twilight. Then came the waves. At first, they were just larger versions of the usual surf, crashing against the base of the rock. But as the storm grew in fury, they became liquid mountains. Thomas, on watch in the lantern room, felt a lurch in his stomach as the first great wave struck the tower, not at its base, but halfway up. The entire granite structure, which had seemed so permanent and immovable, shuddered. It was not a vibration, it was a deep, resonant shove, as if a giant had kicked the tower's foundations. He could hear the deep, thunderous boom of the impact, a sound that was felt in the bones as much as it was heard with the ears. The world outside the glass dissolved into a chaos of white foam and green water. The noise was indescribable, a constant deafening roar like 1,000 freight trains passing at once, punctuated by the high-pitched scream of the wind tearing at the iron dome above. It was impossible to think, impossible to speak. The three men communicated with hand signals, their faces pale and grim in the flickering light of the lamp. The work, however, did not stop. The light was more critical now than ever. In the heart of the storm, with the roar of the sea in his ears, Thomas wound the clockwork mechanism. The familiar clack, clack, clack was almost inaudible beneath the tempest's fury, but it was an act of normalcy, an anchor in the madness. MacLeod, his face a mask of concentration, tended to the lamp, his movements economical and precise, seemingly oblivious to the chaos outside. Hours bled into a day, and the day into a second night. Sleep was impossible. They dozed in chairs in the watchroom, their bodies tense, starting awake every time a particularly violent wave struck the tower. The psychological toll was immense. Being trapped in that vibrating stone tube, surrounded by an elemental fury that wanted to tear them apart, began to fray the edges of their sanity. The crisis came on the second night. There was a sound different from the roar of the storm, a sharp, explosive crack from below, followed by the shattering of glass. Finn, who was on his way down to the kitchen, came scrambling back up the stairs, his face ashen. "The big window," he yelled, his voice barely audible. In the mess, a wave took it out. MacLeod's face hardened. That window was 30 feet above the high water mark. That a wave could reach it was almost unthinkable. The storm boards, he barked. They had thick wooden boards that could be bolted over the inside of the windows in an emergency. But with the window gone, the sea was now pouring directly into the tower. What followed was a nightmare of cold, frantic labor. The three men battled their way down the stairs against a torrent of seawater that was cascading down the steps. The kitchen was a maelstrom. The sea surged in and out of the broken window frame, bringing with it a deep, bone-jarring chill. The stove was extinguished, and their meager furniture was being smashed against the walls. Under MacLeod's shouted commands, they wrestled the heavy stormboard into place. The sea fought them, a living entity trying to force its way in. A rogue wave surged through the opening, knocking Thomas off his feet and sending him crashing against the far wall. For a moment, the icy water closed over his head, and a primal, suffocating panic seized him. Then MacLeod's strong hand was on his collar, hauling him to his feet. They strained together, Finn swearing, MacLeod grunting with effort, and finally, they managed to slam the board into its frame and ram the heavy bolts home. The torrent was reduced to a trickle, seeping around the edges. They stood there, soaked to the skin, shivering uncontrollably in the dark, flooded room. The immediate danger had passed, but the storm still raged outside. They had saved the tower, but their tiny sanctuary had been breached. The sea had gotten in. They retreated to the upper levels, the only dry spaces left. There was no hot food, no dry clothes. They huddled in the watchroom, wrapped in damp blankets, and waited. The storm raged for another full day before its fury finally began to abate. The roar subsided to a groan, then a moan, then a weary sigh. The waves no longer struck the lantern room, and the shuddering of the tower ceased. In the strange ringing silence that followed, Thomas looked out of the watchroom window. The sea was still a mass of chaotic gray peaks, but the sky was beginning to lighten. The siege was over. He looked at the other two men. Finn was slumped in a corner, his face buried in his hands, trembling with exhaustion and reaction. MacLeod stood by the logbook, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly as he made a new entry, 0600. Wind abating, sea remains heavy, stormboard holding on second level, all well. Thomas looked at the words, all well. It was the greatest lie he had ever seen. They were not well. They were exhausted, terrified, and trapped in a cold, damp rock with a broken window. But the light was still turning. The work had been done. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of Trinity House, that was the only thing that mattered. The storm's passing did not bring relief. It brought a new, more insidious kind of misery. The aftermath was a world of damp, echoing silence. The roar of the wind had been replaced by the constant, maddening drip, drip, drip of water seeping through the stone and making its way down to the flooded lower levels. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant seawater. The camaraderie forged in the heat of the crisis evaporated as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind a residue of raw nerves and profound exhaustion. The routine, their only anchor, had been shattered. The kitchen was unusable. They subsisted on hardtack biscuits and cold tinned meat, eaten in the cramped confines of the watchroom. The daily tasks were multiplied by the need for repairs. Hours were spent hauling buckets of seawater up from the kitchen and dumping them out of the high door, a back-breaking and seemingly futile task. The brasswork, their old enemy, was now coated in a crust of salt that was impossible to fully remove. The tower felt less like a sanctuary and more like a wreck, but the worst part was the waiting. The relief boat, the Petrel, was scheduled to arrive in 3 days. That day came and went. The sea, though no longer violent, remained too rough for a landing. The men began to scan the horizon with a desperate, obsessive intensity. Every distant cloud, every flock of gulls, was momentarily mistaken for the smoke of the boat. Each false sighting was a small, sharp stab of disappointment. Their supplies began to run low. They started rationing their fresh water, their tea, their tobacco. The unspoken tensions between the men grew louder in the silence. Finn became sullen and explosive, prone to fits of dark muttering. He would spend hours staring out at the sea, his fists clenched. MacLeod retreated even further into himself, his face a granite mask, his movements slow and deliberate, as if conserving every ounce of energy. Thomas found himself adrift in a sea of memory. In the long silent hours of his watch, with nothing but the rhythmic clack of the mechanism for company, the face of his wife Eleanor and his daughter Alice would appear before him, as clear as if they were standing in the room. He had come here to escape their ghosts, but in this profound isolation, they were more present than ever. He would have long silent conversations with them, his grief a physical ache in his chest. The solitude he had sought as a cure had become a potent poison, concentrating his sorrow until it was almost unbearable. 1 week after the scheduled relief day, their supply of paraffin for the lamp was running dangerously low. MacLeod made the decision. They would reduce the lamp intensity, running it on a lower wick. The powerful beam that was their sole purpose became a weaker, more fragile light. It felt like a deep personal failure. That evening, as Thomas was on watch, staring out into the endless darkness, he saw it, a flicker, a light, where no light should be. He grabbed the binoculars, his hands trembling. It was her, the steady, distant lights of the Petrel. He didn't shout, he simply went down and woke the other two. "The boat," he said, his voice hoarse. The next morning, the relief boat arrived. The sea was still choppy, but the captain was willing to risk a transfer. The process was a study in grim efficiency. The new assistant keeper, a man with a nervous, twitchy face, was winched aboard. Sacks of supplies, barrels of oil, and bags of mail were hoisted up. Then it was Finn's turn to leave. He practically threw himself into the harness, his face alight with a desperate, almost manic glee. He didn't say goodbye. Then it was Thomas's turn. He stood before MacLeod on the narrow stone landing. The wind whipped at his coat. For a moment, he thought the principal keeper might say something, a word of acknowledgement, of thanks, of farewell. But MacLeod simply looked at him with those pale, sea-bleached eyes and gave a single curt nod. He was already turning back to the work, his mind on the supplies that needed stowing, the reports that needed filing. He was part of the tower now. He did not belong to the world of men. As Thomas was swung out over the water, the gap between himself and the tower widening, he felt a strange, unexpected pang. He was leaving a prison, a place of terror and misery. And yet for the past 3 months, it had been his entire world. He looked up at the lantern, now dull and lifeless in the daylight, and felt as though he were leaving a part of himself behind. The journey back to Penzau was a blur. When he finally stepped onto the solid ground of the harbor, the sensation was shocking. The world seemed to tilt and sway beneath his feet. The noise of the town, the shouts of fishermen, the rumble of carts, the cry of gulls fighting over scraps, was a physical assault. After months of near silence, it was an overwhelming, painful cacophony. That evening, he sat in the corner of a crowded, noisy pub. A pint of ale was in his hand, its taste rich and strange. Men were laughing, talking, arguing all around him. He was back in the world of the living, surrounded by humanity, and he had never felt more alone. He had gone to the Dragon's Tooth, seeking to quiet the ghosts of his past, but the tower had simply carved out new hollow spaces inside him. He had survived the storms and the boredom, but he carried the deep, resonant silence of the rock within him now. It was the mark of the keeper, the unsung misery that no one on the shore could ever understand. He had kept the light burning, but in the process, a different kind of light within himself had been irrevocably, eternally extinguished. Final shot is a close-up on Thomas's face in the pub. He looks lost, haunted. He stares into his drink as the sounds of the pub fade away, replaced once more by the slow, rhythmic sound of waves crashing against a distant, lonely rock. Fade to black.